I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got love, peace, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA.
Zenitsu hadn't really meant to make his own style when he'd set out to study with Nezuko, but that was what had more or less happened when he'd combined what he knew of the lightning style and what she'd taught him of the water style. It felt good, being able to actually use more than one technique. He felt useful for once in his life. Well, more so than he had in the past. So he'd written Gramps, letting him know that he couldn't become the lightning successor or even the joint successor. He'd been honored when such had been offered to him, but now, it just didn't feel right. While his new storm style was still based off of speed, the other forms he'd come up with were fundamentally different than anything Gramps had taught him, so they weren't forms he could incorporate into the lightning style. He felt kind of bad, but he was sure Kaigaku would get the first form down eventually. He could be Gramps' successor like he always wanted, and then maybe he'd just leave Zenitsu alone. The yellow-haired boy brushed such thoughts from his head and focused on his current form. Breathing out, taking a step, lifting the sword right there. Breath of Storm, fourth form, L. Renishu, Jaya. He lost concentration and ended up twisting too far and flopped flat on his face at the exclamation of his mangled name. Loud stomping through the undergrowth foretold of the forthcoming boar in human form. Zenitsu groaned. He'd thought that if he went out in the forest to train, he could do so alone, but no. Of course Boar Boy had to half follow, half drag him all the way out here. Maybe he should have just stayed back with the Hashira, as embarrassing as showing them his new forms would be. Zenitsu pushed himself onto his hands. Why did you do that, you ridiculous boar? He'd been about to perfect his form and then he could show Nezuko when she came back and she'd be so impressed that she'd ask him to marry her right then and there. And then she'd. Something's coming, Inosuke said, utterly serious. That caught Zenitsu's attention. Normally, when something came, the wild boy was all for fighting that something. Why did you come to get me, then? Zenitsu asked. For several seconds, the boar-headed boy didn't answer, but the storm breather definitely heard. Nervousness, worry, certainly not anything he'd ever heard from the boy before. Warning bells began to ring in his mind. I've never felt anything like this before, Inosuke finally said. It's really powerful, and I want to fight it, but I need to take my underlings with me. That's why I came to get you, so you can see how awesome and powerful I am. Ah, and there was the Inosuke Zenitsu knew. The yellow-haired boy groaned again and allowed himself to thump back into the forest floor, not caring if he got muddy. Honestly, the farce Inosuke put on. He started, but then something exploded. Literally, they both felt the shock run through the earth from said explosion. Zenitsu shot to his feet and looked into the distance. He could see smoke. Inosuke's head turned in that direction too. Wait, that was, the storm breather said, his voice shaking. The estate. They made the first strike. Inosuke bellowed and took off into the trees, swearing. Wait, Zenitsu said. Part of him wanted to let the idiot run off and find the consequences to his actions. But part of him could just see the look of utter heartbreak and disappointment on Nezuko's face if something happened to her friend. He grit his teeth. Ugh, that boar was going to get him killed. But fine, he should be able to help. Maybe, a little, he hoped. So, against his better judgment, he took off after Inosuke. XXX. Hanako liked Tanjiro. He was a sweet kid that reminded her a little of Tanjiro Nyai, if just a little less forward. He needed more encouragement too. It was a little difference, but it made all the difference in the world to Hanako. Still, she liked him. She liked training with him, especially as he knew enough fire breathing to let her know when she'd done something wrong. And he wanted to train too, so they both worked hard together. When she'd seen him for the first time after she'd come back to Mount Sajiri, she'd almost burst into tears because he looked so much like Rengoku-sensei. And then he'd broken into tears, and she hadn't been able to keep her own back and they'd ended up just sitting there, next to the house, sobbing. She'd apologized for not helping his father and being forced to leave him to die. He'd insisted she didn't need to apologize for anything and his father would want her to live, so he's glad she did. Even if he did want his father back. He insisted he didn't blame her for what had happened, and that she shouldn't either. They'd sort of tiptoed around each other after that, until one day Hanako had gotten tired of it. So she just walked up to him and asked him to train with her. He'd sort of stared at her for several seconds, but that had been after she'd spoken with Nezuko about training too hard, and how she needed to have someone there to supervise her. This counted, right? He'd agreed and they'd trained together every day since. It had been weird, but also healing in a way. With them there training together, getting stronger together, she felt like they were doing something. Something Rengoku-sensei would have very much approved of. It had been a couple of days since then, And that day they'd been training until they lost the light and night began to fade in. They'd finally stopped working and had begun to stretch when Nezuko's crow found them. Attack! Attack! Nezuko's being attacked by a waxing moon. Hanako and Sanjiro had both frozen in horror. Hanako's mind immediately went back to that night, watching the red-haired man from a distance as he fought her sensei as he'd gone to attack him. And Hanako, a voice pulled her out of the memory and she realized where she was again, in a clearing where she'd been training with Sanjiro. She blinked. Run and tell Urokodaki-sensei, the yellow-haired boy said. I'll get more information from the crow and follow. She hesitated because she hated running away. But she could do that. She could get Urokodaki-sensei. And she knew that was the best choice. She nodded, turned towards the house, running as fast as she could, tears streaming down her face as she did. This couldn't be happening. They couldn't lose Nezuko too. They couldn't. Urokodaki-sensei, she screamed. The house came into view, but no one answered. So she tried again. Urokodaki-sensei. Nothing. She raced to the front of the building, seeing her sensei's red mask through the trees and bushes. So be it, she heard him say, and he raised his sword. Wait, why did he have a sword out? He never did that unless he was training. No, that wasn't important right now. Nezuko was important. Urokodaki-sensei, she shrieked as she burst into the clearing. Hanako, no, he yelled back, but she couldn't exactly stop now. It's Nezuko, she insisted. She's being attacked by a... Her voice choked off and she froze. In front of her current sensei stood her former sensei, the one who had been dead. But he was different. Sunset-colored scales on his hands and forearms as well as on the sides of his face under that familiar hair. Strange feet and a tail, also covered in red, orange, and yellow scales. And those eyes. Waxing 6, they said. He was a demon. A waxing moon. She felt her knees give out on her. Sensei, she whispered hoarsely. Oh, there's one of my targets now, the man said, grinning widely. He had fangs, like Oni-san. A choked sound came out of her mouth and she felt tears gather in her eyes, but she couldn't seem to form actual words. Not that she knew what to say anyway. The demon turned back to Urokodaki-sensei with that huge grin. If you hand her over, we don't have to fight. Hand her over. Waxing 6. But she tried to make that fit with the sensei she remembered. The one that had called her sapling. The one that had tried so hard to make things work when she'd come to train under him. It couldn't be. But it was. You always were too naive, the former water pillar replied in a steady voice. Rengoku-sensei shrugged. Worth a shot. Almost without her permission, Hanako's mouth moved, her eyes fixed on the dead man walking. Sensei, she rasped again. The demon frowned but didn't say anything. Rengoku-sensei, Hanako said, forcing herself to speak louder and ignoring the tears streaming down her face. Oh, you knew me too, was all the man said, looking pleased and interested. She just gaped. Had he lost his memories? She knew that happened to some demons, but it hadn't happened to her Oni-san. She did remember him mentioning that he'd lost his memories when he was turned into a demon in those first few loops. Before Hanako could bring herself to answer, Urokodaki-sensei cut in. Hanako, you need to leave. Did your mother find you? She blinked, trying to force her mind to understand the words coming out of her current sensei's mouth. She finally turned her eyes to Urokodaki-sensei, but she felt blank and numb, wrung out and left to dry in the cold. She had to respond. It was hard, but she forced herself to shake her head. No. Hanako, Sanjiro's voice called out and she felt herself tense. No, he couldn't see this. He couldn't. Sanjiro, she said, turning around and forcing her limbs to move. It felt like wading through water, but she managed to get to her feet and rush towards her friend as he, too, came out of the woods. And no, don't look. He had Nezuko's crow cradled against his chest. What? He asked, but then shook his head, eyes focused on her as she ran up and stopped him from going any farther. He didn't seem to notice the extra presence. Nezuko is several cho in that D. He paused, finally looking up. Rection, he finished slowly, eyes fixed on the two men facing off in the center of the clearing in front of the house. Hanako let out a sob. She'd hoped she could stop her friend from seeing this, from the pain she knew it would inevitably bring him. Father, he whispered, his voice small and high-pitched. His eyes stared straight at the man they thought had died. Hanako glanced over her shoulder in time to see the demon frown and glance back at Urokodaki-sensei. Father, he asked. The former water pillar nodded. That is your son, Sanjiro. The demon blinked. I had a son, he asked, then looked back at said son. Oh, I'm assuming Muzan didn't tell you, Urokodaki-sensei said, his voice sounding dry. No, but he didn't have time, Rengoku-sensei said, his voice firming towards the end. He was in a rush. Oh, the man in the Tengu mask asked. Then why is that? The yellow and red-haired demon shrugged. I do not know. Something about plans coming together. He paused, glancing at Hanako and Sanjiro again. I simply know I must return with one of the Kamado children. He paused, but then nodded as if coming to a decision. But I think I'll take both of them. Hanako let out another sob at that and Sanjiro gave a choked gasp. To do so, you will have to go through me, old friend. That seemed to take Rengoku-sensei aback. But then he shook his head regretfully and raised his own sword. Very well. Hanako, Sanjiro, Yurikodaki-sensei said. Run. But, Hanako started. I said run. Their sensei said, his voice loud and harsh. Go now. Before the Kamado sibling could say anything else, Sanjiro grabbed her hand and ducked back into the trees. Her feet moved on instinct as she stared behind her through blurry vision, the clearing disappearing behind the foliage once again. She knew she wouldn't be seeing one of her senseis again, and the fact that she would lose one of them all over again hurt. So much. Find Kamado Tanjiro, Sanjiro said. It took her a moment to realize he was talking to Nezuko's bird, who he threw into the air. Kamado Tanjiro. He's at the swordsmith village. Hanako watched the bird fly off sort of numbly. Would the crow get to Nyai-san in time? She hoped so, with all her heart. She didn't know how else they were going to survive the night. Not with 2 waxing moons, and their highest-ranked demon slayer was a former Hashira, an old man, still strong in his own right. But would it be enough? See, come on, Hanako. Sanjiro spoke again as he pulled her through the trees once more. Hi, she responded and followed. XXX. It didn't take long for Takeo to realize that keeping his eyes open while riding on the back of a pillar going at full speed was a bad idea. He didn't know how quickly they were moving, but it seemed that in one bound, Tomioka-sensei had covered what would have taken them at least 10, if not 15, minutes to walk. Maybe even 20. After a couple of minutes at that speed, Tomioka-sensei grit his teeth. Not fast enough, he muttered. Then he took a deep breath. I must use my arms. Do not let go. Do not hinder my breathing. Oh, that sounded very, very bad. Takeo nodded and his hands gripped the fabric of the haori underneath him. Then he put his head down on his sensei's shoulder. Tomioka-sensei let go of him. Takeo didn't know how that helped the older man move, but it did. He felt the uptick in speed. This wasn't even the fastest breath style out there. Was this speed expected of him when he got older? If he became the water pillar after Tomioka-sensei? He wasn't sure humans were even meant to go this fast. It took his breath away and he was simply riding on his mentor's back, not the one actually running. He didn't know how long they traveled, but it felt both like hours upon hours and only seconds before Sensei stopped. Still too long, his sensei whispered as he paused near a grove of trees and bushes. 20 minutes. Too long. Wow, he'd been running for 20 whole minutes. He didn't even look out of breath, and they'd gotten to Mount Sajiri. It was incredible. Stay here, Tomioka-sensei whispered and twisted his body so Takeo could get off more easily. Keep your sword out and be alert for demons. Stay hidden if at all possible and think up things to ask your family and me if you see us. They may be demons in disguise, so make sure they are things only we would know. Hi, Tomioka-sensei, Takeo whispered, scrambling as best he could into the thicket and trying not to wince at the branches and brambles that stuck him, especially as he tried to maneuver his borrowed sword so he could still swing it if he had to move quickly. Be safe, his sensei said before taking a deep breath and turning in the direction they'd been heading. You too, sensei. Stay alive, Takeo said. The water pillar looked back down and his gaze softened ever so slightly. Takeo could swear he almost saw a corner of the man's mouth perk up. Then he was gone, leaving a very silent patch of forest behind him. Takeo swallowed and leaned back against the bark of one of the trees. It was rough, knobby, and not comfortable at all, but he didn't have much of a choice. He didn't dare move. The forest sounds didn't start back up again and Takeo didn't dare sleep. He'd just woken up anyway. Honestly, he felt restless, worried, and he could do nothing about it. So instead, he said a prayer to the kami for help. Then he focused on his breathing as much as he could, trying to get the rhythm of the breath of water to calm him down. It helped a little. Several minutes later, something snapped and Takeo cut his breath off. His eyes darted around what he could see, but nothing moved. He curled in a little tighter. Then, off to one side, he finally spotted the movement he'd been looking for. It was a fish floating through the air. Its body had a glowing, blue hue to it, although it was also see-through. It was strangely lovely and kind of mesmerizing, watching it just kind of swim lazily through the air. It was so slow and calm, it took Takeo a minute to remember that fish don't fly through the air like they swam through water. It had to be a demon blood art. He was so focused on it that he didn't see the other one sneaking up from behind until it was right above him. I've found you, a creepily sinister voice said. Takeo couldn't help himself. He shrieked and scrambled out of the grove, taking a stance as best he could with his bandaged knee. He didn't see the pot until he'd tripped over it, sprawling backwards and wincing as his spine hit something very much not good for spines to hit. He winced in pain, but movement above him drew his attention. He looked up to see the most hideous monstrosity towering over him. It had dozens of tiny arms sprouting out from a pale-skinned, muscular body, 2 mouths for eyes, an actual vertical eye on its forehead, and an eye for its mouth. And the eyes said waxing 5. Takeo felt his stomach drop out from under him. Such disrespect for the arts. The being screeched at him, "I would kill you, if that man didn't have plans for you." Just when Takeo didn't think he could get any more scared. What? He rasped. Then he realized that to even have a chance, he had to try and fight. He scrambled to his feet again and retook the stance, ignoring the pain in his knee. He'd have to deal with that later. For now, though, breath of water, first form, water surface slash, he said, leaping forward and bringing his sword around to where the demon's neck had been. Takeo's eyes widened. The demon. He'd just been there and then he wasn't. Takeo hadn't moved his eyes. The demon had just disappeared. Behind him he heard the distinctly smug voice of the demon. Water prison pot. Before Takeo knew it, he was surrounded by water. But he was still in the forest. Just, what, how, and he couldn't breathe. Nakime, the demon said, and how could Takeo still hear him so clearly? I'm ready with Muzan-sama's prize. In front of the water Takeo had been trapped in, shoji doors just appeared, and opened to a dark hall on the other side. A hall that had most definitely not been there seconds ago. If Takeo could have breathed, he would have cried out or gasped. As it was, he could only struggle against the edge of the shape of the water prison. He swam forward and pounded on it, panic beginning to take over his mind. Well, then, shall we? The demon asked, and then the pot tipped forward, rolling along and making Takeo sick, and he couldn't even breathe to try and calm his stomach. Even having his sword with him did nothing to help his panic. He just wanted out now. The last thing he saw of the forest was the doors as they closed behind him, doing nothing for his panic. He stretched out towards it, willing his body through the still rolling water, but for naught. The door clicked, leaving him stuck in an impossible building consisting of long, dark corridors and multiple shoji doors, held prisoner by a waxing moon, and drowning in water. I'm sorry, sensei, he thought as the lack of breath began to get to him and spots gathered at the edge of his vision. I'm sorry I couldn't stay safe. If Obanai had to thank the demons staying at Oyakata-sama's estate for one thing, it was opening the door for Hashira to stay there. He wasn't the only Hashira who had asked the core head to let any demon slayers protect him full-time. He would have even compromised on having lower ranks than Hashira, but Oyakata-sama had refused every time. Then the demons came along. Good demons, supposedly. He remained mostly undecided on that one, to be honest, even if he'd come to accept that Kamado and his elk were pretty decent. So far, it was just such a mind-blowing idea. Good demons, seriously, and yet, but it was precisely that attitude that had likely gotten Oyakata-sama to allow demon slayers, even Hashira, to stay at his estate. To protect him, it had taken a load off of everyone's minds. Too bad it didn't actually help. Even as Obanai raced through the rubble towards the figure he could see in the fire, the figure he knew was Kibutsuji Muzan, and how had they missed that? He was right here, under their noses. His mind raced with questions. Why had Oyakata-sama done this? Was this really why he'd insisted they practice at the other end of the compound? Had he planned this? The fires and caution in general had stopped them from getting there as fast as they otherwise should have. But even seconds seemed like too long. Akatsugi seemed to see something and veered off. Maybe one of the children had survived. And then, in a blink, the still burning Muzan was covered in hands. What? They looked to be restraining him. Then, in another blink, a woman was there, arm shoved into Muzan's middle. Akatsugi picked something. No, someone, the demon girl, up, and more of the strange, flesh-like appendages appeared around the demon king. This time sharp and rigid, holding Muzan in place. Demon blood art. The girl. Obanai was sure he wasn't the only one confused right now. But if he was right, he took it back. Kamado's demons were, well, he could admit they were a little better than just decent, he supposed. Turn you human, the woman, another demon was saying as he and his fellow slayers rushed up, swords out. He felt like he was moving in molasses. Why was he too slow? Why was everyone too slow? Nakime. The demon king shrieked, and then there were doors below them and the prize, their goal, fell out of sight. No, Obanai shrieked. He wasn't the only one. He landed in what looked like a very large, old-fashioned mansion. He couldn't see far due to the dim lighting and he hated how silent the place was. He looked around, he was alone. So they'd all been separated, huh? And this was likely another blood art. There was probably no point in taking out his anger, frustration, and grief on what looked and felt like regular floors and doors. Stick to the rules, he told himself. Find the others, regroup, figure out how to take down nope. He couldn't think of anything disgusting or dirty enough to call that being. He made himself take several deep breaths, patted Kaburamaru on the head to reassure him, and then rushed off. This would end tonight, one way or another. He would not let Oyakata-sama's sacrifice go to waste. XXX. Shinobu was the fastest Hashira currently, barring Kamado, and she was putting every ounce of speed into her steps, trusting Kanao to catch up. She cursed Tameo and even Oyakata-sama. Why had they done this? There had to have been another way. She didn't even bother wiping her tears of anger from her eyes. The last week had been hectic. She'd expected everything to calm down after Agatsuma and Hashibara had left. But the very next day they'd gotten the refugees they'd been expecting from the red light district, and the fight with Waxing 6. It had been almost 3 weeks since then and many of the women hadn't properly eaten in almost that long. Obviously thin and wavering on their feet. Shinobu, Ai, Kaio-san and the triplets had practically run themselves ragged trying to get everyone healed up and strong again. She'd requested some more money from Oyakata-sama to get the supplies they needed and he'd sent more than double the expenses. It had surprised her at the time, but now, he'd planned this. He'd known Muzan was coming, they all did, but he'd planned on using himself as bait. That was why the younger children were in the safe house, not just for their protection but for their very survival. And how was she supposed to take this? Knowing Tameo had been in on it, knowing she'd been complicit, knowing both of them would go that far to take Muzan out. It was commendable and awe-inspiring but it hurt. He'd been such a kind, generous, and supportive leader. She looked up to him so much. But Tameo's note had explained that neither she or Oyakata-sama planned on leaving the confrontation alive, and to please come as soon as possible for reinforcement, and she didn't understand. Or she thought she didn't. But then she thought of Dauma and how far she would go to utterly destroy him and it started to make sense. But, still, hadn't there been another way? Even she was looking for another way. She wanted to live through this encounter. A sob escaped her lips, and she could only be thankful no one else was there to see it, forcing her typical mask back into place a second later, although she didn't bother with the smile this time. Tanny, she prayed, please help me get there on time. Please do something to help them. Please let them live. She knew it was hopeless, but she had to ask anyway, because she refused to just give up. She would fight to her very last breath. Doing otherwise would be an insult to her sister's memory and everything Shinobu stood for. Ahead of her, the orange glow of a fire peeked through the trees and an enormous smoke column rose into the air. She pushed just a little further and ended up in the center of the estate where Oyakata-sama's mansion used to be. Now there was nothing but burning ruins. No one was there. She let out one more sob, and then a scream before she pushed her senses out, searching for their target. There, inside the shoji doors, in the ground, she blinked, remembering Kamado's description of the potential waxing third or fourth, and her infinity mansion. For several seconds she contemplated what she could do, head inside the mansion, or stay here. It wasn't even a choice. Knowing Kanao would follow her, she dived into the nearest door. She may not leave tonight, but if she had to go down, she would take as many as she could with her. And one of them would be Dauma. XXX. Zenitsu and Inosuke reached the mansion and raced over the walls only to see a wide area cleared where Oyakata-sama had been staying. Inosuke, can you sense anyone? Zenitsu asked, his fear spiking. Only down there, the boar-headed boy said, pointing to the strange, shoji-like doors in the ground. Zenitsu's eyes widened. What's down there? Why are they there? They weren't there before. Why aren't they burning? And why could he hear such sinister sounds coming out of them? Ha ha! Inosuke yelled as he practically dove down inside one of the random doors. The yellow-haired boy blinked. UIDIIIOOT. He shrieked. Charging in head first was insane and crazy and exactly something that Inosuke would do. He was about to continue screaming at his friend when something interrupted him. Not you. Someone groaned in exasperation from behind him. Zenitsu stiffened and turned around, praying it wasn't. But it was. Of course. Kaigaku ran up behind the strange, normally blank-eyed pillar. The lightning breather's nose crinkled as if he'd smelled something disgusting. Zenitsu had to stop himself from screaming, this time in anger, at the older boy. What happened here? The pillar asked. Zenitsu shook his head. I was out training and came back to this, but I definitely heard demons. You're hearing again. Kaigaku scoffed. The storm breather rolled his eyes at his senpai. Just because he couldn't comprehend it didn't mean it didn't happen. Where are the demons now? The pillar pressed urgently. The blonde winced, but forced himself to listen to the shoji doors again. When a pillar asked you a question, you answered, no matter how young they were. Down there, he said, pointing to the doors in the floor. He may or may not have had a shiver in his voice. The pillar didn't even blink. He just turned and dived into one of the doors. Zenitsu watched with an open mouth. Is everyone here, Ozzy? He screamed, putting his hands on his cheeks and shaking his head back and forth. Well, you haven't changed a bit, Kaigaku said, rolling his own eyes. Just as cowardly as ever. I am not. Zenitsu shot back. Really? Kaigaku asked, leaning forward. Then why are you out here and not in there fighting with everyone else? That took the yellow-haired boy back. I just got here, he defended, but it sounded weak even to him. Kaigaku snorted. Fine. Keep up here and out of everyone's way. Useless. With that, he dived in after the pillar, leaving Zenitsu alone in the burning rubble of what used to be the Yubayashiki estate. The storm breather stared after him, a pained expression on his face. For a moment, the old emotions rose up, confirming what Kaigaku had just hissed at him again. Useless, coward. You can't do anything or save anyone, you weak, useless fool. He shrank back, curling in on himself. Why did he ever think? But then, Nezuko's face popped in from his memories. You're strong, Zenitsu-kun. You're much stronger than you give yourself credit for. How can you believe that? He asked, maybe a little louder than he'd intended. How can you not? But, do you know what I see? She asked, arms folded. I see missions completed. I hit help. Demons dead. Just a fluke. People saved who wouldn't have been without you there. His mouth closed with a clop, but there were still people he could have saved if he weren't such a weakling. She must have sensed his hesitation, because she sighed. Do you believe in me? Did she even have to ask? Of course. She sent him the most gentle, encouraging smile he thought he'd ever seen, and he just fell a little more in love with her. Then can you believe in the fact that I know you're strong? And I'll believe for the both of us until you can believe for yourself. He just stared at her for several seconds because she truly believed that. He didn't understand why or how she could, but she did. He could hear it, and he could believe in her. Why yes, she grinned. Good, now let's go. Zenitsu stared at the open shoji door only a couple of feet away, and forced himself to stand up straight. Nezuko believed in him, and he believed in Nezuko. Kaigaku could go, well, jump into a demon's lair, which was what he was about to do too. He was so going to die, but he wouldn't be a coward. He swallowed and went running forward. Remember me, Nezuko, he yelled as he fell into the mansion, and kept falling, and falling. He was screaming now, and the floor was coming up and he would be smashed and he had to do something. Breath of Storm, second form, Rage and Drum Ring. He moved his body as quickly as he could into the form. He maybe should have used his 8th form, but he'd only just mastered that one and it didn't come as easily. Had he made the right choice? Well, there was no going back now. All he could do was concentrate and it worked. He landed hard, but without any injuries, rolling with the momentum he had left and he was alive. Not just alive, but able-bodied. He just sat there for several seconds, then he began laughing. Ha, 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 ha. I'm alive. Score 1 for Nezuko. Maybe he had a chance at this after all. Then he heard the sound of demons and shrieked. And maybe not. No, he couldn't afford to think like that. The group of demons he came across were mostly low-leveled and he could do this. And this time, he'd use the first form, his lightning form, because he could still use that and use it well, according to even Inosuke. So he did, lightning flashing behind him in his mind's eye. Although, even now when he used that first, pure form, he could almost hear the pitter-patter of raindrops behind him too. It was a little thing, but it seemed like a big change to him too. And all the demons behind him were very, very dead and disintegrating. Score 2 for Nezuko. Right? He could do this. Time to find the demon who had done all of this and then do his Gramps and Nezuko proud. His jaw clenched as he hurried on. Shidru followed Kasan up the mountain, which was kind of exciting as he'd never gone up the mountain before, but mostly it was terrifying. Demons had attacked them the day before they were supposed to move, and he felt so useless right now because he could barely hold a sword and had only just started learning how to swing it, and Yurikodaki-sensei was fighting and he could only run with Kasan up the mountain. He didn't know how long they ran, but he was gasping for breath and the breathing exercises hurt and he had no idea where Nezuko-ni was, but he had a bad feeling about it. Finally, Kasan stopped and Shidru fell to his knees, the sword she'd thrust at him that he'd been carrying, clutched in his numb fingers. Kasan knelt down beside him, putting a hand on his back and rubbing circles while he tried to recover. That's my boy, she said softly. I'm so proud of you for keeping up like that. Her comment made him feel warm inside and he willed his chest to work better as he smiled up at her. What now? He was finally able to ask. Kasan looked back down the mountain worriedly. We've gotten past the traps. It's part of why you're having such a hard time breathing. The air up here is thin. She turned back to him, eyes worried. Shidru, I am so sorry to ask this of you, but I need you to take Rokuta and protect him. That almost caused the 8-year-old to stop breathing. Again. What? Kasan looked pained as she said it, but she put her hands on his cheeks. My brave boy, I'm so proud of you. You've been helping so much. Now I need you to take care of Rokuta while I go and find Hanako and Nezuko. I cannot just leave them behind. He knew that. He did. But why you're leaving us? The traps won't stop a strong demon, she said, hand gesturing to the path they'd just taken. He hadn't seen any traps though, but it might slow them down a little. I need you and Rokuta to hide, and if no one has come for you in the morning, run away. Travel at night, and try to find more demon slayers. They'll be able to help you. Do you understand? He did. She was saying she might never come back, that she may join Tucson on the other side of the Sanzu River. I don't want you to go, he cried, rushing forward and throwing himself at her. She caught him and hugged him tightly. Oh, my dear one, I know. But what kind of a mother would I be if I left Nezuko and Hanako and even Sanjiro to die? I can help them, so I will. She drew back and then touched his forehead with hers. He felt tears running down his cheeks as he looked into her eyes. Oh, she was crying too. That didn't help. Kasan, Rokuta asked, his own voice shaking. Can I trust you, Shidru? Trust you to take care of Rokuta for the night, and maybe longer. He didn't want to, but he didn't want Hanako and Nezuko hurt either, so he nodded. She kissed his forehead. Thank you, my brave boy. I am so proud of you. She hugged him again. He closed his eyes and tried to memorize the feeling of being there in case he never saw her again. Then she turned to Rokuta and similarly hugged him silly. Rokuta, I need you to stay with Shidru. You need to listen to him. Do you understand? Where are you going? He asked, big eyes brimming with tears. To help your sisters, Hanani and Nezuni. Kasan nodded. That's right. Take me. Her face looked so pained Shidru had to look away. I cannot, dear one. That's why I need you to stay with Shidru until I come for you, okay? He bit his lip and didn't take his eyes off of his mother's face. Then, after what seemed like forever, he nodded. Okay. He turned to Shidru, who took his hand. You're going to hide from the bad monsters until I call for you, okay? She told the little boy. He obviously didn't like the sound of that, but he nodded anyway. At that moment, Shidru knew he would die for his little brother. He would do anything he could to make sure that the younger child, at least, survived. He clutched the sword sheath in his hand tighter. Bye, Kasan, Rokuta said quietly, giving their mother another hug as she stood. Save Hanani and Nezuni. Stay safe and stay quiet, she said. Rokuta nodded solemnly. She gave them one final hug before she turned and hurried down the mountain. Obviously, she knew how to avoid the traps if she was hurrying that quickly. They both watched her until they couldn't see or hear her anymore. And then they watched the silent forest where she disappeared for a long while after. Finally, Shidru looked around at the dark, mountain landscape. Come on, Rokuta, he said, rubbing his free hand over his opposite arm and willing away the sudden goosebumps. It wasn't easy to do with the sword still in that hand. Let's find a good place to hide. Okay, the younger boy said, distracted, and then he turned and began to look around. It took a long time, but they finally found a rotted log they could hide under, and hide they did, together, waiting for the dawn to come. XXX. Nezuko was losing. She knew it too. The only reason she hadn't lost already was her new ability to dodge and the reaction times of her body now. This was waxing 4 and there were 3 of them now, and she knew he had a combination form and that the smaller form was likely somewhere else. But it was all she could do to avoid these 3 monsters. And they likely weren't even all there was. She should have known taking off his head had been too easy. She'd hoped she'd be able to decapitate him before he activated his blood art and small counterpart. Apparently not. And it felt like with each head she took, the fighters from them grew stronger. She cartwheeled with one hand out of the way of that stupid leaf-shaped fan and all of its pressure slamming into the ground where she'd just been. That had been close. She kept her eyes open for the next attack. There. She launched off the ground and at a nearby tree, using it to redirect her momentum. It scraped her hands a little, but she didn't have time to think of that as lightning just struck the underbrush she'd just leaped from. Then she had to drop under the flying one's talons as he dove at her, and no sooner had that passed than she saw movement out of the corner of her eye and had to jump over the pressure of the fan again. Honestly, she was surprised she'd lasted for this long. A combination of her training and her new body. It healed quicker than what she was used to, but she didn't want to test those limits, which meant she had to keep dodging. She hadn't even been able to take a swing at any of the demons in the last several seconds, minutes, hours. She grit her teeth, but kept her constant concentration breathing. At this rate, though, she'd have to switch to the Hinokami Kagura, and she wasn't entirely sure if that would give her enough strength to take these demons down. How many times could she cut off their heads? That was a thought she realized as she flipped off of the tree she'd been holding on to the barest moment before lightning touched it, and consequently her. Did she have to cut off his head for them to regenerate a new body? Or was that just anywhere? She was positive he would reform, but she'd take a couple of moments to try and figure everything out if she could buy those. So she kept watching and there, the flying aspect swooped down and grabbed for her. Instead of dodging or letting it grab her, though, she twisted so she grabbed him, even as he flew away from the others, all squawking in surprise. Then she focused. Hinokami Kagura, clear blue sky. More squawking as she cut the demon in literal half, thankful that she hadn't been in the position to actually see the body split apart afterward. Then she and the demon went crashing down. Never change styles in the middle of a form. She remembered her brother telling her once while they sparred. You can change styles in the middle of a fight, but you may tear your body apart if you do it in the middle of a form. Apparently he knew that from experience. But the thing was, the Hinokami Kagura hurt to use, like her water and vine forms used to. But they didn't anymore and she needed the stamina. So she changed her constant concentration breathing back to vine breathing and used her 8th form, apical kelp shaft descending to slow her descent. She landed on the ground a fair ways away from the winged demon. Or the top half, in any case. He thrashed and yelled, but she'd long since tuned his words out, simply watching as he began to regrow the bottom part of his body, much slower than what she'd seen previous. And the legs, she could see them off to one side, were not growing anything. Okay, maybe she could actually do this. Rushing forward, she winced and grit her teeth as she cut the guy in half again, vertically. Hating that she was having to torture him like this. It made her a little sick, but if she couldn't kill him, she didn't have much of a choice. Then she stepped back and took a deep breath, calming herself down and centering her thoughts. She could. Something moved. She dodged, but not fast enough. The sudden pressure on the bottom half of her body caught her in mid-leap, forcing her to the ground. I got her. The fan-wielding aspect of the demon yelled. Nezuko gasped and tried to force herself to breathe. She reached forward with her free arms, dragging herself out of the pressured area by grabbing onto some saplings and pulling as hard as she could. It felt immensely slow, but likely only took her a few seconds because she refused to give in. She pushed herself harder because she had to get out now. Then she was free, although she almost felt worse than she had before. The fan demon was not pleased with her escape and raised the fan for another swat. Also, behind and above him, she could see the lightning demon descending like an arrow, ready to thrust that rod into her. She rolled to the left, kicking out with her legs, kicking a section of a downed tree into the fan demon. She grit her teeth, after being nearly squashed. They really hurt, but she was determined to push through the pain. The fan demon's eyes widened and he swept the fan to destroy the log, forcing him to miss hitting Nezuko. One taken care of for the moment. Unfortunately, she didn't have time to switch breathing forms again, so she used one of her own moves. Vine breathing, form 2, curling tendril. Much like the clear blue sky of sun breathing and water wheel of water breathing, curling tendril dealt with twisting her body to create a circular cutting motion. But she'd designed this one to be smaller, tighter, which in turn gave her more options when it came to her momentum. By moving her blade away from or closer to her body, she could cut at various speeds to throw off her enemy's rhythm, or an extremely quick speed to outpace said enemy. With a split-second decision to make, she chose the after, and with just enough knowledge of lightning breathing to add that extra boost, she managed to cut the descending demon in two, then backed away, breathing hard. She'd learned her lesson from last time, though. Not bothering to stick around, she turned and rushed away. They'd catch up soon enough. Glancing up at the sky, she realized that the stars had come out. How long had she been fighting? She was starting to feel it. But she had to find that little guy or keep fighting until the dawn. She didn't have a choice. Not if she wanted to live. Urokodaki-sensei, she whispered to herself, where are you? Part of her wondered if she really wanted to know. Because if Waxing 4 was here, and he'd attacked with another waxing moon in another life. Please be safe, she said, including her whole family in that thought. Then she saw the regenerated winged demon come screeching towards her. She just pushed herself forward harder, heading right for him. Maybe she would die like this, but she'd do her best to kill him first. She didn't notice the vine-like shape beginning to crawl its way across her face and down her neck to disappear into her demon slayer uniform. All she knew was that she suddenly felt even faster than she had before, and somehow stronger. She could still feel the burn of her straining muscles, but it seemed far away and unimportant just then. The demon let out a yelp as she once again cut him straight down the middle, not noticing where he landed behind her and not turning to look. She could see the fan demon ahead of her and had to jump onto and bounce through the trees to get over him and his attack. He'd already waved his fan and couldn't bring it up in time. She went to use an 8 form to hit him from above, but something slammed into her side and then pain as lightning shot through her. She screamed and fell to the ground, rolling over the undergrowth. She at least managed to keep hold of her sword. She put up a good fight. One of the demons said. That was actually fun. You disgust me, another one said. If this was going on in the demon's head all the time, no wonder he was mad. No, focus, she told herself. Get up. But her vision swam and her limbs didn't feel right. She still made herself begin to get up through sheer force of will. Just let me squash her. She managed to get to her knees, desperately willing the world to stop spinning. Whatever, just another shriek cut them off and a pair of legs landed in front of her firmly, clad in a demon slayer's uniform. Nezuko almost sobbed in relief. Someone had come. But who? She looked up to see a half Haori and long, dark hair. Jijiu-san, she asked, not registering her impolite addressing of him in her dazed state. Get up, he said, not turning to face her. We have a demon to kill. She glanced over to see the 4th demon she'd been waiting for grow from the missing head of the fan demon form. The others looked, well, somewhere between livid, excited and flabbergasted. Hi, she grunted and forced herself to her feet, finally. Then she took a stance next to him. Maybe with a pillar by her side, they could succeed in this. She leaped forward as did the demons and Tomioka-san, and the next round began. XXX. Earlier, the last time Sakonji had fought Shinjiro, he'd easily been the better of the two of them. That certainly wasn't the case anymore. It was everything he could do to keep up with the demon given his aching joints and sore back. He hated getting old. He'd been too old for fights like this 10 years ago, maybe even 20 if he were being honest with himself. He was definitely not at his prime. But there was also something to be said for experience, simply due to the sheer amount of hours he'd put into practicing. Hunting demons, fighting other slayers, and training, he could anticipate small openings and precise steps. He could angle his sword when defending to corral the demon where he needed. During his youth, he would have had a stronger body, but would he have been able to exert as much control over the fight as he currently could? He didn't think so. It helped that Rengoku, or Sinahi, he supposed, wasn't utilizing his breathing form to its fullest extent as well. Half the time, Sakonji was sure the demon was only acting on instinct, not on conscious thought for those forms. That had been both positive and negative in the fight as anyone acting on instinct reacted faster and harder and hit more fully. However, not having conscious thought of the actual forms meant he would use one form where another would have been more beneficial. Sakonji wondered if he even truly remembered the forms. The demon must have been told he used to be a swordsman, but that didn't mean he could remember his training. Muzan must have been very frustrated with that. Good. A swipe the former water pillar barely dodged left a long scratch stinging on his left arm, but he ignored it and fought on. 7th form, piercing raindrop, he thought to himself as he dove at an opening the demon gave him. Rengoku's eyes widened and he finally backed away, holding his stomach where Sakonji had stabbed him. The battle paused, giving the older man a much-needed break. He took advantage to assess his body and relax the muscles he needed to keep aches and muscle spasms away for as long as he could. He didn't relax his stance though, keeping his eyes fixed on the demon through the mask. They said you'd be good, Sinahi said with that all too familiar smile. But I thought I'd be able to beat you quickly. You have my apologies for my arrogance. That was ominous, and so like Shinjiro, he hated seeing this twisted form of his friend. It was worse than knowing he died 100 times. It seems I will have to use this then. The demon held his hand out to the side, and blood dripped. Sakonji swore silently. He had to end this now. He rushed forward, another piercing raindrop already in the works. Demon blood art, field of flaming flowers. Immediately around the waxing moon, flames sprouted, and Sakonji had to redirect to a waterfall basin attack instead so as to avoid the flowers. Except they grew and Shin. Sinahi met his attack and shoved him back so Sakonji went skidding on the dirt. He came to a stop, taking in all the detail he could, then realized only one of the flowers had grown large, but the others were already getting bigger as well. And then Sakonji saw it. The stem of the flowers, the base, was orange. It faded to an obvious red and then blue at the top where it fanned out. Ruka meant a bright blue flower. 3 colors, 3 family members. His friend was still there. Shinjiro, he said, hoping he didn't sound as desperate as he suddenly felt. You need to stop this. The demon's smile dimmed ever so slightly. I cannot. I vowed to serve my lord who gave me this power, and I will not go back on my word. He took one hand off of his sword and looked down at it, opening and closing the fingers. Why did you want that power? Shinjiro seemed taken aback by that question. Doesn't everyone want power? Only those who have their reasons. To protect themselves or their family, to live a healthier life, to take revenge, to stop pain, or sometimes just to control the people around them in a misguided attempt to control their own life. Which is yours, Shinjiro? Sinai, the demon corrected, but a troubled expression had crossed his face, smile completely gone. Did you know you are married? Sakonji asked. She died years ago, but her name was Ruka. He gestured to the now multiplying flowers. The demon's eyes widened, and he stepped back from his flowers, looking down at them as if they'd betrayed him. Why did you want power? Sakonji pushed. The troubled look deepened. The demon started, but didn't look like he knew how to finish that sentence. Come back, Shinjiro. He held his hand out, taking a risk, doing what Tanjiro and Nezuko, and likely even Kai would have done. We have ways to turn you back to human. The demon's eyes widened. You do. Sakonji nodded. Yes. The demon looked uncertain, and for just a second, Sakonji thought it would work. Then Sinahi yelled out, hands coming to his head and clutching the sides of it. No, the demon yelled, of course not. I will get the girl, as I promised, my lord. Sakonji closed his eyes and his heart sank. So be it. Shinjiro looked up, his own eyes sorrowful and pleading. The former water pillar nodded, and then was rushing forward with a Form 9, splashing water flow, turbulent. He'd have to avoid those flowers after all. They'd stopped growing when Sakonji had held his hand out, but now they began to grow larger and spread again. He picked out areas he might be able to step and began to make his way through the growing field of fire. The demon countered with the flame-breathing 4th form. Sakonji grit his teeth and pushed harder, but then he felt heat through his pants. He realized they'd caught fire. He doubted he could put it out, so he just kept going, pushing harder and harder until his strike missed. Sinaha's didn't. Sakonji's eyes widened as an immense pain blossomed in his side. The demon had pierced his liver. He grit his teeth and willed his arms to move, meaning to take off this man's head anyway. I'm sorry, Sinahi. No, Shinjiro said. Then his foot flew out and Sakonji slid off the blade, suddenly flying back through the air. He crashed into the house, only barely able to brace himself with what breathing he could. But it wasn't enough to stop him from blacking out. His last view of the demon his friend had become was the man standing there, surrounded by blue, flaming flowers. Sakonji was surprised he woke again. By that time, night had fully fallen. Or was that just the pain clouding his vision? He didn't know. He lay sprawled on his left arm. His entire abdomen area felt wet and warm and sticky and... Wait, he was getting moved. Sensei. No. Sakonji took a deep breath and did what he could to stop the bleeding, but he'd been out too long. He'd lost too much blood. If he didn't get attention soon. But then, so be it. At least he got to see Jiu one last time. My son, he said, hating how weak he sounded, but he managed a smile. The young man bit his lip in a rare show of emotion. What happened? The current water pillar managed to ask. Rengoku. Shinjiro has been turned into a demon, he explained between breaths. Constant concentration in this state was hard. What? Jiu exclaimed, horrified. Waxing. 6. The water pillar bit his lip again, looking torn. Yeah, Sakonji would make that choice for him. Another waxing moon. Fighting Nezuko. He pointed in her general direction, hoping that the children had been able to avoid Sina his attention. But sensei, no, Sakonji insisted. My students are more important. Then he let his voice soften. Please, Jiu. The boy closed his eyes, pained, but then he nodded. What about you, sensei? Leave me be. But, hurry, Jiu. With the same expression as before, the water pillar gently leaned Sakonji against the side of his house. It wasn't very comfortable, but Sakonji didn't think he'd have to deal with that for long. I love you, son, he whispered, figuring now was definitely a time to confess that. He could swear Jiu, who he hadn't seen cry in years, had tears in his eyes. I love you too. Tusan, he whispered, and then was gone, leaving Sakonji to smile after him. Tanjiro didn't know how long it took him to reach Urakodaki's, but night had fallen by the time he got there. It had taken too long. He only paused once, just outside the area Urakodaki-sensei claimed as he sensed a demon. But it was so faint, the barest residue of a demon passing through, at best. Perhaps just the demon attacking. He clenched his teeth and pushed himself forward as fast as he could. In less than a minute, he'd landed in the clearing outside his family's and sensei's house when the smell of blood practically assaulted him. He had to stomp down on the urge to feed and glance towards the source. His blood ran cold. Urokodaki-sensei, he shrieked, rushing forward and stopping by the man kneeling down. Was he dead? He didn't smell dead yet, but it was close. He put a hand on the old man's neck to feel for a pulse and found one. Weak though it was, the ever-familiar mask had slid to one side and down, so Tanjiro could see his sensei's eyes open a little, heavy-lidded and barely able to focus as he turned his head, allowing it to flop as if the effort of controlling the entire motion was just too much. After several seconds of struggle, he managed to find Tanjiro and smiled. "Tanjiro, my boy," he slurred. Tanjiro felt his gut clench. Urokodaki was dying, and he knew it. "I wanted to see you again. So proud." The time traveler's gut clenched. He hadn't expected Urokodaki-sensei to say something like that. Sensei, I could save you," he said, hating how his voice pleaded. A slight frown pulled at the older man's face. "How?" Tanjiro winced. "I could turn you into a demon," he muttered, blushing and looking away in embarrassment and shame. For several seconds, neither one of them spoke until finally Urokodaki shook his head in that flopping way. "I'm old, tired, want to rest, just sad, won't be able to teach brothers." It felt as if someone had reached into the time traveler's chest and squeezed his still beating heart. "But Urokodaki-sensei, we're working on a cure now. We'll likely have one in a couple of weeks or months. You could live." But the old man shook his head again. "Too dangerous. Would want to eat kids." Well, he wasn't wrong. "But I could stop you." Urokodaki-sensei, with great effort, lifted his hand and flopped it on Tanjiro's shoulder. "Tanjiro, let me go. But I wanted to get through a loop without losing anyone," the time traveler said, wiping the tears from his eyes angrily. He didn't ever remember having lost Urokodaki-sensei before. Not like this. Not possible. Tanjiro shook his head, not wanting to believe it. "They were so close." "People die," Sensei said, allowing his arm to fall back down. "You focus on saving sisters." Rengoku targeted them. Tanjiro frowned. Was that Urokodaki-sensei not remembering things correctly? "Rengoku-san is at Oyakata-sama's house," he said slowly, thinking of the pillar. Sensei shook his head again, and his eyes closed. "Shin, father, demon, 6, that didn't make a whole lot of sense either. Before he could think farther on it, though, Urokodaki-sensei spoke again. "Tell Nezuko, Kai, family, was, honor, good, students, so, proud." Tanjiro bit his lip, not caring that he punctured the skin. He hated this, but he wouldn't begrudge his sensei his dying wish. "Of course, I'll tell them," he said earnestly, grabbing his sensei's cold hand. He resisted the urge to heat it up with his blood art. His sensei had made his wishes known, and he had to respect that. And Tanjiro, the old man's eyes were closed, and he wasn't moving a lot, and Tanjiro gulped. "Yes, sensei." The man just whispered one more word. "When?" The demon gulped, blinked more tears out of his eyes and nodded vigorously. "I will, sensei. I promise." The old man didn't respond, a slight smile on his face. It felt wrong to leave him there, but sensei had said that his siblings were in trouble, so he didn't have much of a choice. He hated that too. "I'll be back soon, sensei," he promised, then took a deep breath sniffing the air. Nezuko, off to his left, and Jiu was with her. He almost melted in relief, even if they were fighting waxing for. He would have to leave that to them for now. The other demon was ahead of him, up the mountain, and he smelled familiar. Tanjiro's eyes shot open. "Rengoku, Shin, father." Muzan turned him. The demon felt his fists clench and he was growling, but he needed to stay calm. He took another breath. Shinjiro and Hanako were in that direction too, as was Kasan, Shidru and Rokuta, although their scents were fainter. He could just tear through the forest, and he needed to get there yesterday. So he nodded, made an approximate estimation, and breathed. In a swirl of plasma, in the shape of a combination of fire and lightning, he vanished. XXX. Sakonji had the vaguest sense of crossing a bridge, but the next thing he remembered was waking up among the lilies. The red spider lilies. Butterflies flitted from flower to flower, dancing in the sunlight, and he could hear cicadas despite it not being the right time of year, or quite hot enough. No, he felt comfortable. His joints didn't ache. He blinked, trying to remember what had just happened. Wait, he'd seen Jiu and Tanjiro and Shinjiro. His heart ached and he wanted to go help, but he knew he couldn't. Why, sensei? A voice behind him said. Sakonji froze. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned and saw children, so many children, coming forward, each with a fox mask on their face or sitting on the side of their head. He knew them, each and every one of them. He opened his mouth, but words failed him. My dear ones, he managed to choke out eventually. As if on cue, the children rushed forward. No, he said, taking a step back, fear welling inside him. The boys and girls all paused, frowning. I don't deserve any recognition, he said. I got you all killed. He didn't feel the tears that came to his eyes in the normal sense, but he knew they'd begun to leak down his face. I am so sorry. Don't be stupid, sensei. One familiar boy came forward, arms crossed in front of him in obvious annoyance. His fox mask mirrored the scar near the corner of his mouth. Sabito, he whispered. We died young, but we were living on borrowed time anyway, the boy continued. Yes, a girl with dark hair also came forward, a soft smile on her lips. Nekomo, most of us would have died even earlier without you, sensei. You gave us a reason to keep going. Her smile widened to a point where she closed her eyes. You became our home, and none of us regret that. A chorus of agreements came from the other students. Then one of them, Sakonji didn't see which one, shouted, so just let us hug you already. He cried harder as the children came forward, but he didn't back away this time. You are all my home too, he said back, welcoming their embrace. Welcome home, sensei, Sabito muttered. Sakonji hugged him tighter. Now they just had to wait for Jiu and the Kamados. He hoped they'd wait a long time. XXX. To Sinaha's knowledge, he'd only existed for a little over a week. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He knew he'd existed before that as a human, but he didn't really remember it. They told him that was normal, that if it would be useful to Muzan-sama, then he would get his memories back. He'd accepted that and moved on because he didn't have a reason to doubt them. Then Kokashibo-sama had been asked to take him and see if he remembered his sword fighting techniques. That had confused Sinahi until he'd had the sword they'd given him in his hand. It felt so natural. He'd been taught to breathe differently, and then the higher-ranked demon had explained how to use the air he took in to strengthen his body. Between that and the human bodies they'd practically thrown at him the entire week, he'd grown quickly and had been able to take over the rank of waxing 6 in record time. Part of him had been thrilled at the accomplishment, but part of him had been wary. Something about waxing 1 he didn't like at all, and he would prefer to avoid the man, not have to sit in on multiple conversations with him. Once Kokashibo-sama had explained what he'd needed to, he'd left and Sinahi couldn't have been more relieved. And then he'd been sent on his first mission, retrieve one of the Kamado siblings. He hadn't expected to run into people who claimed to know him. He hadn't expected to be told he used to have students, that he used to have a son, that he still had a son. He also hadn't expected what he'd found when he'd arrived at Mount Sajiri. He'd been told that the demon slayers would do everything they could to kill him and stop him from achieving his goal. He was told they would be ruthless to demons, that they would kill demons just for trying to survive. So when the former water pillar had held his hand out and asked him to come back, it had shocked Sinahi to his very core. They'd been fighting and he would fulfill his duty, and then that man had said they used to be friends. And he'd proved it. The waxing moon had stabbed him fatally if he didn't get treated soon enough, and knocked him out when Muzan-sama had made his presence and displeasure at Sinaha's traitorous thoughts known. If he'd said yes to the offer, the Demon King would have killed him right then. He was sure. So he'd done what he had to. But then he'd seen the body of the old man, the human who claimed to know him, lying defenseless on the ground, and he'd been tempted to eat, but it had felt so wrong. He couldn't bring himself to do it, so he'd left the old man behind, aiming to find the children instead. He could sense them nearby, but couldn't pinpoint them. Up the mountain, perhaps. He hurried into the trees, grateful to leave the smell of the older man's blood behind him, and a log suspended by a rope swung down into him, knocking him off to the side. What? It didn't hurt him, but it did surprise him. He hadn't been expecting or even looking out for that, as he'd been too focused on the children's presences and searching for other demon slayers. Cautious and a little confused, he stepped back and scrutinized the forest around him. It took him a moment to really see them, but see them he did. Traps. Nothing that could do any real damage to him, or any demon, but he hadn't detected them because he was used to being attacked by people who broadcasted their intent. Traps didn't do that. He blinked and then he smiled. What clever children. They would make marvelous demons. Sinahi would have to go a little slower than he'd like if he wanted to avoid being attacked by the traps, And that would probably be preferable, seeing as if he just tore down the forest. It would be easier to hurt his targets and they would hear him coming and may be able to hide or prepare for him somehow. Very well, traversing the trapped area it was. He could give these children the chase they wanted for a little while. With a nod of his head, he began running again, at a marginally slower pace so he could avoid setting off traps and avoid the traps themselves altogether when he did. Or destroy them. That worked too, but it felt a little like cheating, so he tried not to as much. The game of cat and mouse had begun. It would end very soon, but he would enjoy it while he could. XXX. Tanjiro had been the one to point out Inosuke's sensing ability to Nezuko, just making the offhand comment about how amazing the boar-headed boy was for his awareness of people he shouldn't be able to see, to a point where he'd even made it one of his breathing forms. And when he wasn't using the form, he still had a passive sense that went beyond most other demon slayers, up to and including some Hashira. The seemingly offhanded comment had actually explained why Inosuke could fight while wearing that boar mask all the time. She knew he could somehow see through those strange, googly eyes, or maybe the mouth or something, but he obviously didn't rely on his sight often. That was the first time her Nyai-san had pointed it out to her, while on the trip home to see their family. It wasn't the last time. By the fourth time, she'd realized he wanted her to learn something from it, so she'd asked him outright. He'd explained what their father had told him regarding the Hinokami Kagura, about how one's mind began to disappear the more they danced, eventually becoming invisible. How one had to utilize all 5 senses of their body into one sharp focus to accomplish a state of mind where she could access the transparent world, as he called it. Then he'd explained how their father had killed the bear they'd lived off of for the rest of that winter before he died. The story had surprised her, both because her brother remembered that far back and that her father had been able to do that just days before his death. Her older brother had seemed so sad when he spoke of it, likely remembering their father, and it had made her feel nostalgic, missing him. Eventually, she'd asked him how to reach a point where she could see the transparent world, if he'd had any tips or suggestions. He'd explained how reaching that state wasn't possible if one did not push themselves to their absolute limits, or if one didn't have a demon slayer's mark, or if one didn't focus completely on the movements of their fight. He even went on to explain the state one could reach where they had no presence at all, but that was an even harder technique. Then he'd told her to train hard and she'd get there eventually. Unfortunately, to her knowledge, she hadn't manifested a mark yet, even though she felt as if she was indeed pushing herself to the limits. However, reaching that state would be the easiest way to kill Waxing 4. It frustrated her that she needed it now but couldn't attain it, had never even come close before. So she looked for other methods. As gruesome as it sounded, she was willing to look inside the chest of each form she fought to find the actual Hantengu, and had thought that was what she would be required to do to survive the fight and save her family. Unfortunately, fighting him had been more difficult than she'd thought, and she'd already known it wouldn't be an easy fight. She'd been so thankful when Jiyu-san had come, as she'd been on the back foot and wasn't sure she would have survived otherwise. Fighting next to the water pillar made the fight more bearable, but his arrival was like putting on a hat to shade her from the sun. It didn't stop the sun from shining or lighting up the world around her, it just made long, hot days less dangerous. It didn't remove the danger of overheating altogether, and she still wasn't sure they could win. Even with Jiyu-san there, she knew that if she let up, it would be the end for her and likely the water pillar as well. So she fought her hardest, until the demon's forms joined together again to form a much younger looking demon. And then the fight had pushed both of them to their limits even more so than before. So much so that when Nezuko saw blue creeping across Jiyu's cheeks, it cost her. She suddenly found herself wrapped in wood as it grew and squeezed. Fortunately, the older slayer cut her loose fairly quickly. Jiyu-san, she gasped as they leaped away, trying to put distance between them and the demon. You have your mark. She pointed to her cheek. He blinked and went to touch his cheek, but a sense of warning had them both jumping away from the crash of the demon landing where they'd just been. That explains some things, she heard him say as they rushed around behind Waxing 4 to attack in unison, both using the first forms of their styles to do so. It didn't work and they had to duck away from the demon's attack. Then Jiyu-san fell on his stomach and Nezuko saw that a branch of the wood had caught his ankle. It was her turn to cut him loose. She used her second form, curling tendril, to do so. He quickly rolled out of the way of more attacks and jumped to his feet. She noticed he was favoring the leg that had been caught and winced before she had to turn her attention back to the fight. Since you have the mark, she yelled at him, you need to go and find the little him. That's his true form. How do you know that? The demon in front of them asked almost monotonously. Almost. It wasn't difficult to sense his anger even if she couldn't hear it in his voice. Neither one of the demon slayers answered. Why can you not go? Jiyu asked, frowning as they ducked away from another attack. I don't have the mark. He looked so confused. Then what is that moving on the side of your face and neck? She paused to stare at him, forcing him to dive at her and push her out of the way of yet another attack. She was grateful for that as her mind didn't seem to want to process his words. I have a mark. I assumed you knew, he said, then his eyes, looking past her, widened. 11th form, low. Nezuko gasped and closed her eyes, grasping at Jiu-san's Haori instinctively. He managed to stop the attack, thank the kami. I didn't know, she said, although you're right, that does explain some things. Like that boost of speed and strength she'd gotten. Then she saw more all too fast-growing trees pop from the ground and grow at high speed, sharp points headed for them. Thankfully, she managed to use Jiu as a springboard and used her apical kelp column, descending to at least make the trees less deadly. Her attack gave the water pillar time to jump to the side. Go after him, he said. But, she started, however he cut her off. Go, I can handle this. I just need to focus. She bit her lip and looked at the forest behind her. Okay, but stay alive. Jiu-san just hummed in response, just loud enough for her to hear him. Then she turned and ran into the forest. You will not, the demon started, but apparently Jiu stepped in between her and the waxing moon. To get to her, you'll have to go through me first, he said. Very well. Nezuko tried not to listen to whatever was behind her after that, doing her best to focus on looking for the little rendition of waxing 4 that was his true form. And she'd have to reach the transparent world too. But she could do this. A particularly loud clash from behind her had her wincing. She had to. They were running on borrowed time. Both Sanjiro and Hanako knew it. They both knew how to get up the mountain without setting off any traps, something his father hadn't ever bothered to do as he'd been so busy training everyone else in his own style. While here, either that, or he'd been sparring with Kamado Tanjiro and Yurikodaki sensei, and, don't think about it. He rubbed his sleeve across his eyes and barely saw the next trap in time to dodge around it. Hanako was sobbing quietly behind him and followed every move he made without question. He suddenly felt a wave of resentment. Here he was leading her through their death trap of a mountain and she couldn't even seem to focus enough to help him. It wasn't her father that had been. The thought wasn't fair and he knew it. Firstly, she was 9. He was almost 14. Secondly, she'd seen his father fighting waxing 1 for her, and to find out that this was the result. Of course she'd find it difficult, traumatizing even. And yet, he couldn't seem to banish the boiling feeling in his gut. Normally, he didn't have a problem with his anger. Oni-san had taught him too well, and if he could get past his father's old habits then his unfair anger towards a girl so much younger than him should be easy to banish. So why wasn't it? He wished Kyojiro was here. Kyojiro who was a pillar and could potentially fight off a waxing moon. Kyojiro who had always been a better fighter than Sanjiro. Kyojiro who could help him see why and understand his emotions. He remembered back to one of the last times he'd been so upset at father and Kyojiro had spoken to him about why their father acted the way he did. He spoke of how the former flame pillar wasn't mad at his sons, not really. He was mad at himself, and at the situation in general, and the loss of his beloved wife. He just didn't know how to channel that anger and so he took it out on them. It wasn't fair then. Had never been okay. But at least he'd understood better, and he'd tried not to be angry in hopes that his father would eventually. His thought process faded off for a second and he slowed to a stop. Behind him, Hanako did the same. Was he doing the same thing his father did? Was he really angry at himself? He thought about that and realized that yes, that was part of it, and it hurt to realize, but it also felt better somehow. The rage and anger wasn't gone, but it felt smaller, more manageable. Sanjiro, Hanako whispered. He shook his head and continued up the mountain. She followed wordlessly, something he was grateful for. How long would the traps hold up a waxing moon? Did they have seconds, minutes, or perhaps it was best to not think about that either. Instead of focusing on their hopeless situation, he thought back to his previous train of thought. He was mad at himself, but that wasn't all. He wasn't mad at Hanako, really. He was angry at Muzan, of course, and that had changed too. Before he'd hated the vague threat out there, away from him. He knew Kyojiro could be killed by any demon he ran across, but his brother was a Hashira and could take care of himself. Now it had gotten personal and he felt a deep hatred for the progenitor of demons. But that wasn't all of it either. What else was going on? Why was he so angry and why couldn't he really manage it? It took him all too long to realize it. He was angry at his father. No, he was beyond angry and beyond livid and, at that moment, that single moment, he hated Rengoku Shinjiro. He'd been directing his anger away from his father for so long that he hadn't realized. But now, his father, who had been so kind and encouraging to them at their young ages, and then his father who had been the angry, distant drunk Sanjiro had to tiptoe around, And then the man who had gotten better and closer to what he'd been like before, but sadder. And then he'd just abandoned Sanjuro with the water cultivator. And then he'd done everything he could for a girl who wasn't even his child. Up to and including sacrificing himself for said child. And now he was back as this monster. The air was getting thin and they were nearing the edge of the trapped area. He didn't know what to do. Should they hide? Or keep running? And why hadn't Waxing 6 caught? There you are. The demon that used to be his father jumped down in front of them as they both stumbled back. He grinned like he was Kyojiro. That just made Sanjuro angrier. He grit his teeth. Sanjuro, you're hurting me, Hanako whispered, whimpering a little. He immediately released her hand. Sorry, he whispered, feeling a deep shame begin to combat his anger, but it didn't do much, especially when the demon who used to be his father was just standing there, grinning at them. Clever, leading me in here, he said. But did you think it would really stop me? No, Sanjuro said, honestly. His faff, the waxing moon tipped his head to one side. Then what was your plan? He didn't really have one. They could only hope that Yurakodaki-sensei. Wait, if the demon was here then Yurakodaki-sensei. No, he hoped Hanako hadn't put that together yet. To get away from you, he finally spat, angrier than he'd ever been in his life. Really? The demon had the audacity to look amused. Amused? Well, shut up, Sanjuro screamed. He felt Hanako jump behind him and knew she was probably staring at him and his unusual behavior. I hate you. That seemed to take the demon by surprise. You hate me. Why? Am I not your father? You are not my father. Even if you used to be, that only makes everything worse. My father would never give in to that man. At least the older man's smile had vanished as he stared at the two children. Sanjuro-kun, Hanako whispered fearfully. Why did everything have to change? Sanjuro yelled, ignoring the girl behind him. I have memories of you being so good and we were so happy, but then Kasen died and she took every piece of happiness with her except Kyojiro. The Isan was the person who loved me and helped me and trained me when you were too drunk too. And even when you weren't, you were so mean. I have 2 sons, the demon asked, sounding surprised. That did not make the situation better. And then Nyai-san left. He became a Hashira and it still wasn't good enough for you. Nothing ever was. And I was left there with you and you didn't care. I was so happy when you started to get better again and then you died. Except you didn't. And now this. Just leave us alone. He was pleading now and couldn't see well through the tears in his eyes. Go away and leave us with whatever happy memories we had of my father before. He stood there breathing hard, not just because of the thin air, but he felt empty and wrung out, like everything he'd ever felt had just sort of exploded out of him, leaving nothing but a shell behind. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad either. He also felt so guilty for being so terribly rude and awful to Hanako and his father, even if it wasn't really his father anymore. He was the calm one, the quiet one, and here he just yelled all of that out. Even if he hadn't said anything untrue. I'm sorry I used to be such a terrible person, the demon said slowly. And that, Sanjuro just sort of slumped down onto his knees, letting out a keening cry he couldn't seem to keep in. I just want my 2 sen back, he sobbed. Perhaps this development was more positive than I realized, the demon said thoughtfully. Sanjuro paused and looked up. What? He asked, rasped really, because he couldn't have meant. This way we can start over, he said with a smile. We can leave all the pain behind. Then he held out his hand. What do you say? The younger Rengoku couldn't seem to wrap his head around what his father was saying, and he hated that part of him was tempted, forgetting all of this, all the pain and hurt and nastiness between them, and just starting over. That sounded lovely, but he knew it wouldn't be like that. The demon was offering to turn him into a demon, into someone who had to kill to live. He was asking him to turn his back on everything his family and his father had ever stood for, and he couldn't do that. Before he could say anything, though, Hanako burst in. Don't you dare say that, she screamed. Don't you ever say that again. Rengoku-sensei was one of the kindest men I have ever met. He was so patient and kind, even if he was strict and didn't know how to act around me because I'm a girl. But do you know what his favorite thing to talk about was? Sanjuro. She suddenly turned to him, causing him to jump a bit. What? He asked. He would talk about how much he regretted the last few years of his life, and about how much he loved you and how proud he was of you and Kyojiro-san. He would talk about how much he wished you had a better father, and that your mother was still around. But mostly he would talk about how you could never disappoint him. She knelt down in front of Sanjuro, putting her hands on his shoulders as he stared at her in awe. What? He heard himself say. He loved you so much, and he was so sorry. He let you stay here because he thought that's what you wanted. And he was so angry at himself for driving you away. But he hadn't. Not really. Not like that. He always said that what he'd done wasn't okay, would never be okay. He didn't know how to handle everything that happened right in a row, and he said that made him a lousy father. But he wanted to be better. He was trying, and you know it. She wasn't wrong. He had been trying. He said he hoped that one day he'd be the father you deserve again. She smiled at him, but then she turned to the demon and her smile disappeared. And leaving that behind, pretending it didn't happen, is like spitting on his memory. So don't you ever say anything like that again, do you understand? Then she did the craziest thing Tanjiro had ever seen. She drew her sword and took a stance between him and the waxing moon. Neither of them stood a chance, and she had to know that. But I see why Muzan-sama wants you so badly, I think, the demon said thoughtfully. And he looked over at Tanjiro and seemed to deflate again. I am sorry for everything, even if I can't remember. However, I must obey my lord. I will take you both to him. With that, he drew his own sword and Tanjiro gulped, scrambling to his feet and drawing his sword too. I will give you one final chance to come peacefully. Never, Hanako yelled. All right, Tanjiro said, taking a stand by her side. The demon sighed. But then his eyes went wide and he dodged to one side and back, away from Tanjiro and Hanako. Where he once stood, Kamado Tanjiro had practically cleared a swath of trees, causing several traps to spring and then break in the wake of his sword swing. Then he landed calmly and stood between them. At first, Tanjiro could only feel relief, but then he saw the newcomer's face and realized this may not be as positive of an outcome as he'd initially thought. He thought he'd been angry, and it had been such a foreign feeling and so potent. And it felt like nothing compared to what was radiating off of the sun pillar as he stood there, facing the former flame pillar. Stay away from my family, he said, his voice calm but tight, as if he were holding back a tsunami. If this was him holding back, and Nai-san, Hanako whispered, just as surprised. Hanako, Tanjiro, run, and without waiting for their response, Tanjiro launched himself at the former flame pillar. XXX. The initial attack on the Yubayashiki estate hadn't gone nearly as well as Muzan had hoped, but it was still within acceptable margins. However, he got a flash of a vision from his newest waxing moon that let him know something certainly had gone right. Kamado Tanjiro had taken the bait. Good. Now all he needed to do was burn this poison out, finish off the demon slayers here and claim his prize. This would end tonight, and Kamado Tanjiro would regret ever having been born. This was taking too long. Muzan almost had to acknowledge a grudging respect for Tameo, making up something that could cause even his nigh-perfect body to have this much trouble. Mostly, though, he had to push away his rage at her sheer audacity. He didn't have time for this. He'd known that starting his attack early would mean the core could survive, but he could still deal them a devastating enough blow that they wouldn't be able to recover for decades or centuries, if at all. But to do that, he needed to make sure he captured or killed all the pillars, and he needed to make sure he faced Kamado alone. But all in good time. First, the core members, and he didn't want to wait. He wanted to make sure that everyone was waiting for him when he got out of this state. Just not this long. He had time, but this was pushing it, and he'd thought so long and hard about this trap. Fortunately, he could still communicate with nearby demons, although he had to concentrate, which would mean taking time off of breaking down Tameo's poison. He didn't like it, but it seemed he'd have to spare a couple of seconds. He switched his focus, ignoring how the poison began to work at breaking him down again. Nakheim, he said silently, you said you had eyes on all of the Hashira. He received a positive emotion back in confirmation. Bring them all in. Now, except for those at Mount Sajiri, but she would know that. She'd better know that. Another acknowledgement. She couldn't speak to answer back, but SHP could hear him at least as she was close enough. Then he turned his attention back to breaking the poison in his system down. He had things to do tonight, after all. XXX. Mitsuri tried not to think about how wrong everything had just gone. She didn't want to think about how they'd been duped so badly. She didn't want to think about the fact that Tanjiro and Hajime-san had all been stationed and ready for a waxing moon attack, only to be faced with weak demons most Mizunoto could handle. She didn't want to think about how Muzan had somehow figured out their plans and used their station as a distraction to launch the real attack against Yubayashiki-sama and Yurikodaki-san. She didn't want to think about how it would still take her and Hajime-san hours to get to the Yubayashiki estate, even traveling as quickly as they could. She didn't want to think about the incredibly difficult fights she knew she would come across once she got there, or the fact that Obanai-san was already there. She didn't want to think about Tanjiro's rage and anguish as he was forced to choose between his kind, supportive employer and his family. It just wasn't fair. Not that anything in life ever really was, but her train of thought cut right off as the branch she'd been about to land on was no longer available. Instead, shoji doors appeared and opened, and she really didn't have time to do much more than shriek before she was falling. Turning so she could see the door above her, she realized she had fallen alone. What? And then she remembered the information they had on the waxing moon Nakheim. Oh, well, she'd count it as a blessing that she was somewhere she could hopefully get to Musen and his demons sooner. It wasn't difficult to kick off the wall to her left and then the one on the opposite side, and back again, making sure she slowed down enough to land safely. Then she stood and looked around, hearing nothing but silence. Which way to go? In the end, she picked one hallway at random in the general direction she'd been going with Haimjima-san and Shinazugawa-kun. Then she took off, face set in determination. If she was lucky, she'd run into Obanai-san. Wouldn't that be romantic? Then they could fight their way out of here together. She didn't even bother to fight the blush that came to her cheeks with that thought, instead choosing to run down the hallway even faster, head filled with dreams of accidental rendezvous and working together with her possible future husband to destroy demons. Or perhaps she'd fight her way to him and rescue him and save him. Or he could save her. She wasn't picky. "I'm coming, Obanai-san," she said almost giddily. Then she remembered the crow's message and her smile disappeared. "In Oyakata-sama," she whispered quietly, "please let me be on time. XXX. Shinobu was determined to get to the bottom of this maze. All beings worked off of patterns, demons included, and she already had a basic idea worked out in her mind. But she'd had to alter it multiple times, and the largest problem was that she wasn't entirely sure where in the maze to go. Where would Musen be? At the very center. That seemed like something that would suit his ego, but he also tended to be intelligent. So would he be closer to one corner or to the edge of this maze? Ultimately, she decided to head towards where she guessed the center would be. Even if she didn't come across the Demon King himself, she'd come across something, she was sure. Now if only she had some backup. Perhaps she should have waited for Kano after all. Still, there was no help for it at the moment. A loud laugh had her pausing and glancing down a hallway she'd been about to pass by. That hadn't sounded like the Demon King and was too young to be any of his known lackeys. It did sound familiar though. She followed the sound down a couple of halls, turning left, then right, and then left again, and finally right once more. There she found a hallway covered in dissolving demons. In the center of those demons stood one Hashibara Inosuke, his chest thrown out and hands on his hips as he laughed triumphantly. If only you'd known to not challenge the mighty Hashibara-sama, you would still be alive too. Oh, Hashibara-san. Shinobu cut in, plastering a smile on her face. It became far more real when the boy froze at the sound of her voice. He turned around, slowly, as if not believing what he'd heard. "What a fortuitous meeting," she said, clapping her hands together. "What are you doing here?" he yelped, pointing at her as if he didn't believe his own senses. "Why, searching for Musen, of course," she replied brightly. "And now that we've found each other, we should stick together, just in case. I don't need you or anyone to help me." "Hashibara-san," she cut him off, perhaps a little coldly. "I don't think you realize the kind of demons we may come up against. I would much rather have another slayer at my back than nothing. Do you think this makes me weak?" She could practically hear him opening and closing his mouth in the pause that followed. "Good, then we will go together. Would you like to lead?" He huffed. "Fine. I know where strong demons are, so you should follow me." With that, he turned and stomped off down the hall angrily. Shinobu sighed and then shook her head fondly. The boy was rough, frustrating and obsessed with strength, but he was also a good fighter, cared for his friends, and learned quickly. Honestly, she could have come across someone worse to fight with first. Still shaking her head, she followed the boy down the hall. XXX. The gradual dropping off of and then lack of missions in the last months hadn't fazed Miib. Imagawa, on the other hand, had been a nervous wreck. Or, well, he would have been, had she not been there to be her usual, sturdy rock. The water breather couldn't help but admire her stalwart calmness, even as he envied it a little. What he hadn't regretted was his time getting to know her more in a less tense setting. For the first time in a very long while, they had free time, and while they both trained in their styles, they were also able to do other things, like travel. They'd even been able to finally visit each other's family and make introductions all around. She got to meet his parents, and he got to meet her only living relative, her mother. While there, he'd approached both of them about an omiai, and after that, everything had happened really fast, ending with it becoming official. In a little over a month's time, he would marry the woman he looked up to the most and hope he could be even half the man she deserved. All in all, he hadn't ever felt so content or excited for the future in his life. So of course it had to all go south. He had long since fallen asleep that particular night and thus hadn't noticed when the strange shoji doors appeared under him as he slept. All he knew was that he heard Miib shouting in the next room. He'd sat upright in his bed, lunged towards the door and barely had time to grab his clothes and sword before he was falling. She called out something about doors and demons, so something similar must have happened to her. I'll find you," he yelled out before the doors closed and he had to focus on landing. The ground approached at an alarming rate, but he had more than one technique that would help him. He used a series of second form water wheel to slow his momentum, and while he landed heavily, he took a familiar offensive stance and looked around. It took a moment for his surroundings to stop spinning, and at that point he found himself in an empty, dimly lit corridor. Thankful that he'd at least had the presence of mind to grab his uniform and sword, he changed quickly, situated the bundle of sleeping clothes and blankets on his back and set off to find his fiancée. He soon found himself in a maze where other demon slayers seemed rather scarce. Unfortunately, demons weren't. He found many low-level monsters and several mid-levels, and few of them were truly easy for him to fight if only because of sheer number. But he did come out of the encounters alive, so he could meet up with Mieb. He wouldn't let himself even consider the normal doubts that tended to plague him. He had to come out of this alive, so he would. End of story. More than half an hour later, he found himself nursing far too many scrapes and bruises, a couple of claw marks, a uniform torn in many places and simply ragged in others, as well as an aching foot from when he'd landed on it wrong. But he was alive and he could still fight, so he went on. He didn't dare call out for Mieb as that would draw too many demons to him, but he kept his senses peeled. A spinning loud noise had him ducking and spinning around, already beginning a water surface slash. The figure who had made the noise flipped right over him and it took him a minute to follow said figure and recognize it. "Hey, Kanroji-san?" he asked. The pink-haired girl landed on the other side, a bright smile on her face. Good reaction. Not good enough if he couldn't even hit her. But he couldn't exactly bring himself to regret that at this moment. "Have you come across any other demon slayers?" he asked, not really expecting anything but unable to squash his hope. Unfortunately, she shook her head. "Not since I came down here." Imagawa slumped a little. "Oh, are you looking for someone in particular?" He blinked. "Oh, yes, my fiancé, Sawe Mieb." And that suddenly, her eyes lit up and she cupped her face in her hands. "Your fiancé," she practically squealed. Imagawa winced a little, looking around to make sure demons hadn't heard that and come looking for them. "Why yes, is she a demon slayer too?" He blinked. "Yes, stone breather. She's been my partner for a couple of years now, actually." He hadn't realized it had been that long. Kenroji leaned even farther forward, beaming. "That's so romantic. Do you both use the same breath style?" Imagawa backed away, just to establish a little more space between them. "No, I use water breathing." "You said she was a stone breather." She paused and cocked her head to one side thoughtfully. "I haven't heard of a woman using that style before." "Mieb isn't typical," he finally said. "She's much stockier than most women I've met and much stronger than me, but he wouldn't want her any other way. She was also so kind and considerate. He just didn't understand how she could embody so many amazing things all at once." That seemed to take the other woman by surprise as her expression switched to shock and she blinked at him. "She's stronger than you." Imagawa nodded, a little shamefaced but proud enough of Mieb that he knew his own shame didn't matter. "Why yeah, in just about every way." For another very long moment, she just stared at him, and then she looked as if she wanted to cry. "She has truly found an amazing fiancé, then." She smiled, though this one looked softer and smaller and yet felt more real somehow. "I would be truly jealous if I didn't have an omiai set up next week myself." His eyes widened for a moment, and then he smiled warmly. "I am happy for you, Kenroji-san." "Thank you," she said happily. Then she raced over to him and took his arm. He was shorter than her, so it was a little awkward, and he wasn't quite sure what had just happened until she spoke again. "Now, tell me all about your fiancée and we'll go off to find her." With that she began to drag him down the hallway. "Hi" was all he could really say to that. He'd never pass up a chance to go on about his partner and soon-to-be wife after all. XXX. Zenitsu didn't know how this mansion, castle, enormous house thing could be so big, but he could hear echoes that went out way too far. He was honestly surprised he hadn't caught up with Kaigaku once he'd jumped down. They'd gone down the same hole after all. Part of him was kind of glad, but most of him was really scared and he'd like someone else there with him. Maybe not Kaigaku, but the pillar guy, or Inosuke. He shook the thought from his head and focused on his surroundings again. It had taken him a while to realize the structure reminded him of that one house and the demon with the drums that Nezuko had taken care of, except much bigger. Hadn't that guy been a former Kazuki? Had he been kicked out because the Demon King found a better, similar blood art in one of his demons? Zenitsu shuddered at the kind of nasty politics that suggested. Wait, was that? He definitely heard a fight in the distance, But what caught his attention? Kaigaku. He bit his lip, glancing away down another hallway in the opposite direction. Yeah, that looked good. Kaigaku could take care of himself and he could. A cry cut him off. A very pained cry. And then, oh, you'll make quite the art piece. To think, I've done so much for Muzan-sama today. I'm positive I'll be promoted over that scaredy cat, finally, as I deserve. And Kaigaku whimpered, in pain and fear. The idea of Kaigaku being afraid of anything like that just didn't compute. Before Zenitsu could think better of it, he was rushing down the hallway towards his senpai. Unless, the demon said thoughtfully, you join us. The yellow-haired boy froze, which made him trip and sprawl on the floor. What? Muzan-sama wants us to recruit as many strong candidates for demons as possible to replenish the ranks, you demon slayers. He said the name so mockingly, Zenitsu almost cringed. Have obliterated. The storm breather scrambled to his feet and began running again, expecting Kaigaku to spit back some vitriol. But all he heard was silence. Zenitsu was too far away to really hear what his senpai was thinking. But he had a bad feeling about this and put more breathing speed into his run. He had to push off walls to turn at this speed, but okay, this time, when Zenitsu froze, he was mid-leap. Because what? That had been Kaigaku. Had he really just? Had he? But the younger slayer barely caught himself and stumbled again. What was that? The demon's deep voice asked. Zenitsu must be close enough for them to hear him now, too. He heard some rustling of clothing, first from the demons in Kaigaku's direction, and then from another part of this insane mansion. Was someone else coming? He sure hoped so. And then the demon spoke again. Were you really trying to get away from me? The demon asked, laughing. A waxing moon. Zenitsu had figured it was a Kazuki, but hearing it sent a zing of fear through his spine, along with relief. Kaigaku had just been stalling for time, which meant Zenitsu had to go now. Waxing moon or not, his senpai was in trouble. He hurried down the hall, still using lightning breathing to do so. He may have come up with his own style, but he didn't have the heart to rename the first and only lightning form he'd ever learned, and it was still the only one that came truly naturally to him. At HRK from Kaigaku and the wet sound of something stabbing through flesh met his ears and he started running again. But his heart felt frozen in his chest. You agreed. Now you have no choice, the demon said, sounding almost sultry. Kaigaku's heart sped up and now Zenitsu could hear his panic and fear, and he turned just in time to see the most hideous demon he'd ever had the displeasure of seeing. He had a strange torso rising from a pot and multiple tiny hands sticking out all over his grotesquely pale body. There were, actually, a lot of pots all over the room, now that he noticed, but what really had his attention was one of the disturbingly small hands shoved into Kaigaku's chest. Blood dripped down the older boy's chin and his eyes fixed on the demon in front of him. He didn't have any hands, only bloody stumps where said hands used to be. Zenitsu could hear blood rushing through the limb and into his senpai. "No!" He screamed and quickly used a thunderclap flash, eightfold to sever the arm, and several others while he was at it. He turned to use another attack to take the demon's head off, but to his surprise, the demon wasn't there anymore. He'd vanished. Oh ho, what is this? Zenitsu heard the demon on the other side of the room before he manifested from another pot, and oh, head on. The thing was even uglier than he'd thought. What are you doing here? Kaigaku's weak voice came from behind him and Zenitsu glanced his way for just the barest moment. He'd collapsed on the floor, looking up at Zenitsu with conflicting emotions. The younger slayer knew that if he said he'd come to rescue his senpai, the older boy would only get angry. So he looked back at the demon, who seemed to be watching them with amused interest. My job. You wore him down for me, right? He heard Kaigaku blink several times, then huff a little, pained snort. The pots, his senpai said. He switches between them. Fast. Zenitsu felt himself stiffen, but then nodded in acknowledgement. You're not going to kill him? The demon asked, sounding annoyed. He is becoming a demon. Almost as if on cue, Kaigaku's back arched and he yelled, screamed, in pain. I was hoping to catch that in a moment. It could be my next great masterpiece. He sounded almost exultant, but then he paused. But would it be out of duty or kindness, I wonder? Kindness, Zenitsu blurted, unable to really process what he was hearing. You humans don't like seeing others in pain, right? It takes days for strong demon slayers to fully become a demon. Each second will be agony. Another scream from Kaigaku. Why did the demon sound like he'd utterly enjoy that? Zenitsu didn't understand, and his disgust for this being rose several notches. Kaigaku choked and writhed. It reminded the storm breather of when Nezuko had almost been turned into a demon. Had that been why she'd been able to hold on for so long? How many days? Zenitsu asked worriedly, wondering how long they had, wanting to glance back at his senpai, but not willing to take his eyes off of the demon again. He'd been lucky the waxing moon hadn't attacked before. Only a day or two, I think, the demon said thoughtfully. Nezuko had held on for almost 3. He'd always known she was so strong. But could senpai hold on for that long? He doubted it, not necessarily because of strength, but his body didn't have the resistance Nezuko's did. You're really not going to kill him? Zenitsu grit his teeth. I thought you were recruiting. Why would you want me to? I told you. My next masterpiece. Masterpiece. Of course. I am an artist. Would you like to see my most recent art piece? He gestured to a pot between the 2 demon slayers and himself. It shook and then out rose the most disgusting pile of mangled bodies Zenitsu had ever seen. He wanted to throw up. Behind him, Kaigaku let out another strangled sound, something between disgust and pain. The demon didn't seem to be paying attention to their reactions anymore. I call it agony and hopelessness. These were demon slayers I found wandering around the hallways here after all, lost hopelessly in our very own infinity mansion. He gestured around them, indicating the building. Zenitsu didn't know many demon slayers. He didn't recognize the faces of those he could see at all, but a deep-seated rage began to build in his stomach, under the disgust. So, what do you? Thunderclap flash, Godspeed. With that, he tore through the room, destroyed pots crumbling in his wake, especially the one with the bodies, that fell to the ground as well with a sickening, wet thwump. He'd gone for the waxing moon's throat again, but the thing disappeared again. He heard the shocked voice of the Kazuki from behind him and took a deep breath. There was a reason he wanted to learn more than the thunderclap flash, why he had to make his own style. He didn't have the energy for more than a couple of those at a time. He'd have to wait and use it at the most opportune moment. Until then, though, he couldn't stop attacking or defending. You, how dare you? The demon shrieked. My art. You ruined my art. That's not art, Zenitsu yelled. It's disgusting and degrading to those you've killed. Art makes a statement. The demon argued back. It's there to make you feel. Thus it is art. The blonde wasn't an artist, but he was pretty sure the demon was wrong. The only statement that, he pointed to the mess of bodies with his sword, made was that you're disgusting. Demon, filth, Kaigaku said, taking Zenitsu aback a little. He wasn't used to his senpai agreeing with him. The demon just glowered. No one with such a lack of vision should be recruited, he said, completely ignoring Kaigaku and focusing on Zenitsu, who couldn't help but think that was a little unfair. You need to die. With that, he disappeared and Zenitsu only heard the barest whooshing sound behind him. He ducked and rolled and went to attack the demon who had appeared in a pot he'd marked earlier. Storm breathing, second form, Ragin drum ring, but the demon disappeared just before his sword struck the creature's neck. There weren't any other pots near Zenitsu that he hadn't destroyed, but he sensed something nonetheless and dodged out of the way of another attack with a storm breath. It was barely fast enough. I hate making such fast work. The demon glowered from a pot that hadn't been there before. Rushed art is shoddy art. Personally, Zenitsu thought all his art was shoddy, but didn't see much of a point in saying that with anything but his sword. He prepared for another attack, but another rustle of clothing and a blur out of the corner of his eye made him pause. Fourth form, Crimson Hanagoromo, a high-pitched, calm and steady voice said, and the pot with the demon in it fell to pieces. Unfortunately, the attack didn't strike the demon, but that had been a masterful attack nonetheless. Zenitsu couldn't help but be taken back at the familiar figure that stood up and turned to face the demon's new position in another corner of the room. Kano-chan. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And comment down your opinion on this video. Thanks for stopping by and I'll see you in the next one.